Welcome to the Contemplative Science Podcast. My name is Jamie, and as always, I'm joined by co-host Dr. Mark Miller. Mark, how are you, man?
Hey, James, how's it going? I'm good, thanks.
Yeah, I'm excited today. Today we're lucky enough to be welcoming Kaira Jewel Lingo onto the show. Kaira is a Buddhist teacher who has spent decades weaving mindfulness and meditation with social justice. She was ordained as a nun of 15 years in Thich Nhat Hanh's Order of Interbeing, recently published We Are Made for These Times, skillfully moving through times of transition and challenge, and has both a BA and MA in Anthropology and Social Sciences from Stanford University. Kaira, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, oh, so you wrote that life is full of change: birth, death, marriage, divorce, a new relationship, losing or starting a job, beginning a new phase in life or ending one. Change is stressful even when it's much desired or anticipated. The unknown can feel scary and threatening. And we're constantly faced, it seems to me, with this problem of fundamental managing change. And what I want to do today is try and break down, with reference to your formal training and the fruits it's produced, some of the ways we can deal with what life has to throw at us. And to start, I want to get a sense of what's actually happening here. So, from the outside looking in, one of the biggest challenges or biggest changes you went through in your life was ordaining as a nun and then transitioning back into regular life. How was that? What were the particular challenges around change you ran into when you were ordaining?
So there were some similarities actually with how I grew up, because I grew up in a residential community that was actually constructed around monastic values, but it was lay people with families. But so certain things were familiar, like waking up with a bell at 5 or something like that, going to some kind of collective worship practice, meals together, singing, working together, living simply. I mean, my family grew up living on a very small stipend, so we had hand-me-down clothes, and as a nun, we had clothes given to us. We had, a very small, pocket money every month just to be able to buy a phone card. In those days, we could call our families using a phone card. So, so there were certain similarities, and it was a big transition, nevertheless, because I was living in rural France, and my family was in the U.S., and I was, starting to learn Vietnamese because most of the monks and nuns were from Vietnam. I was learning French so I could be car maintenance person and take care of our cars with the French mechanics. But I was basically, I think one of the biggest transitions was, you know, I wasn't a free agent in the sense that I could do whatever I wanted as an independent individual. I was part of a cell in this larger body. And so if the community needed me to go to California, for instance, to help start a new monastery, Deer Park Monastery, then it wasn't like we were forced to do things if we really didn't want to, but we were training to respond to the needs of this community that we were now a part of. If I wanted to visit my family, I had to ask permission, and I needed to take another sister with me. So I always had the Sangha around me. Anytime we wanted to go somewhere outside of the monastery, we had to ask permission, because it meant, is there a car available? Is this a good reason to make an outing? Who would drive? How would we get gas money from the treasurer? Would we be back in time for the next program of the community on the schedule? So, my whole life was committed and dedicated to this larger priority of the community. So following the schedule, even if there were times I didn't want to, I made this commitment to be part of this community. And so, it was like, well, how can I really try to show up? If I'm sick, of course, I'll, let people know and I won't have to come. But, there's a lot of individual ego that can surface and be like, well, you don't really have to go, or, just stay in bed and read a book, And so it was always like, no, this is, you know, who I'm committing now to grow into. So working against that tendency to just think about myself or, stay comfortable. Um, so that was a huge transition, was just, becoming one collective body, a part of a collective body rather than, just following my own individual whims. Um, and um, and really, like, living in community life was very intense, where um, you can have friendships, you can be close to people, but your real purpose is to grow your heart so that you can include everyone. So not to have exclusive connections with people that don't allow you to begin to learn and accept and learn to love others. And so, this looking for safety, looking for belonging and comfort with particular relationships that were really nourishing for me, but always knowing that that wasn't the end goal, just to, be comfortable with those few friends or, sisters or lay people that I was close to, but that, the new monastics coming in, or the new lay people who were coming into our community, how could I really welcome them and keep space for them, So again, like practicing, more kind of selflessness, not in the sense of denying yourself and your true needs, but a generosity of spirit, and like really, like, everyone is welcome. Everyone, is we tried to accept everyone when they would come to the monastery, like it was everyone's home. So
What were the stress? So I have a quite a clear sense of what the stresses and strains of everyday non-monastic life are, because I have them, and obviously you now have them too, given you're not in the monastery. But I'm interested in what the monastic version of that is. When it's a Tuesday afternoon, 3 years in, what's on your mind? Like, what are the
yeah,
anxieties of the day?
yeah. Um, well, certainly, you know, um, you're always in relationship with people. So you have older brothers and sisters that you are being mentored by, and you have younger brothers and sisters that you are mentoring. And conflict is stressful, and so if there were, if you were always working on some kind of team, so everyone was part of a cooking team, or like you were on a rotation. So every few days you'd cook, every few days you'd wash dishes, every few days you'd chop vegetables, every few days you'd be assigned to some other task, and you'd always do it with the same group of people. That would change every few months. If you didn't get along with someone on your cooking team, or they were often late, or if I was often late, there could be little resentments that would start to grow. So um, conflict was stressful because these were people you couldn't avoid. It's not like you would go home and not see them. You'd see them all day long, in the dining hall and working in the garden or in the office together, and then back in the nuns' quarters, and then in the in the meditation hall. So you weren't, it wasn't like you could have a break from people that you were not getting along with.
There's always a chance for stress no matter where we are. Hey,
Yes,
I remember like a
yes.
couple of long-term retreats I've been on and catching myself sort of griping at somebody, at how somebody had washed a dish. I mean, we're silent, we're not speaking, but I'm
Yeah,
watching how other people are washing their dishes and
exactly,
building up these weird
exactly.
stories on the inside. And meanwhile, we're
Yeah,
not speaking, we're practicing loving kindness, through much of the day, and still there's little rubs of stress in even optimal
Yes.
spaces. What a funny
Yes.
thing.
Yes. Our minds stay with us wherever we
You're
go.
right, indeed. Indeed.
Our judging, our comparing. So that was a form of stress. Like also, if there was something we wanted to do, we weren't sure we would get permission from the community to do. Sometimes, yeah, there were maybe we wanted to have a solo retreat and have a week on our own during our lazy days, but if there weren't enough people around and someone was still needed to be, taking care of things, or if, other elder sisters already had booked some of those little huts. So there were things you couldn't just, have what you wanted when so many other people's needs were being, taken into account. Um, and you might someone who you loved might leave. They might be assigned to another monastery, or they might actually leave the community. That was really devastating as a younger nun, when a sister or brother that I really admired would decide they didn't want to be a monastic anymore. That was very stressful. Or yeah, you being asked to travel somewhere, or maybe being invited to travel somewhere you wanted to travel, but then you had to get permission, and you had to find the right people to go with you, and sometimes it would work out, sometimes it wouldn't. So, all the unknowns of, like, you don't get to decide.
But actually, quite a lot of that just sounds like life, actually.
Yeah,
We feel
yeah,
good when we get the things we like, and it's challenging when we're struggling to get the things and then we don't get them, and we
yeah,
love people and they go away.
yeah.
And we're
And,
forced to
and,
be
and there
around
was
people that we don't love.
exactly, exactly, same things, right? Same
Yeah.
things. And there were also the stresses of, like, deadlines, even in the monastery. So I did a lot of editing of Thai's books. So he would give me, say, here's some of the transcripts of these talks, make it into a book, and you'd have a deadline. So the Sangha would give me time. I could take my, work to a little place away from everyone and work on it all day for a few weeks. But you had to come up, connect with the editor of the publishing company and meet the deadlines. And so even in this meditative environment, there was the stress also of, like, needing to get work done by a certain time.
And so during your time there, you obviously learnt a huge amount, kind of the theory in the Buddhist practices, but also in your real practical life about dealing with change. And I wanted to know what the lessons were above all else that sort of emerged from that period.
You know, having models around me of people who had gone through really huge changes, like Thai himself, my teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, who went through, several wars in Vietnam, being exiled, having to start all over in France, starting multiple monasteries, moving from a not very well-known teacher to a world-renowned teacher, um, and seeing how he basically, the same teachings of dwelling in the present moment and staying connected to the body and the breath, and basically slowing down enough to know what's happening. That saw him through all of those changes. And he was a very happy, loving, beautiful person. So it's just having a model of someone who had been able to go through extreme challenge and tragedy in his life, and not be bitter or smaller because of it, was I think one of the hugest lessons. Was like, okay, like, I learned, I think, more than anything in that time, that suffering and difficulties were not, um, didn't have to be seen as a problem. They could really be seen as something to practice with and to grow with, And of course, I wouldn't bring them on me intentionally. I wouldn't make my life more difficult than it needed to be. But
Yeah,
when
it's
it was
difficult just by
difficult,
itself.
yeah, well, that
Conditions
it's
will,
there,
conditions will
right?
make it hard. So that's enough.
Yes. But when it's there, this attitude of, okay, I have gone through difficulties before. I have found my way through. I have seen many other people make their way through difficulties gracefully. So I am willing, basically, I'm willing to be with this difficult moment rather than fight it and make it worse. So let me be with it. Let me soften in the face of it and learn what I can from this moment.
So,
So
so you bring up something really interesting there, which is, of course, you don't choose to make your life more difficult, but life will be inevitably difficult. Now, my question is the following. How do we learn to kind of change our relationship with change, all while validly at some stages trying to, I don't know if resist is the right language, but some things are valuable and we want to keep them going.
yeah,
How do
yeah,
we be open to changing our relationship with change while at the same time wanting to protect things that are in our lives?
yeah, beautiful question. Um, I think this is where the practice of equanimity is really helpful. It's like we do whatever we can, if we have to really make a huge effort to preserve or save or create something that we really believe in. At the end of the day, we do our best, and then we may or may not succeed. And it's not always the case that that's relating to our effort. Sometimes the conditions aren't sufficient for something to manifest, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't still put out the effort. We do our best. If all these other conditions are sufficient, it will manifest. And if they're not, it won't manifest. And doesn't mean that our efforts are wasted. We did our best and we have to let go. So I think as it relates to change, we need to, you know, really understand the truth of impermanence, that things are always changing. Sometimes it's moving in the direction we want it to go. Sometimes it's moving in a different direction than we want. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't really stand up and try to influence things so that they can be more in the direction of compassion, of love, of care, of justice, but that we also can't do those things with an attachment to the outcome of how it will turn out. We do it because it's right to do it. It may be successful, it may not, but we know that, I was reading a quote from Mahatma Gandhi saying, as much as it seems like those that are creating harm are, all powerful, always these efforts to oppress, to harm others end up, becoming weakened, falling away, becoming unsuccessful. And so he was saying the effort to bring about justice, to bring about wholeness, freedom, well-being for the, for everyone, those efforts ultimately prevail.
Yeah.
And so I think having that understanding that things are always changing, we need to be able to let go of things we can't control, but we still give our very best, 100% of our effort towards what we see as a noble path, and we work with whatever comes from that. But we can also have a kind of trust and faith that in the end, our efforts won't be in vain if they are really aligned with truth, with wisdom, with goodness, with beauty. Some outcome will come, even if it's after we've died, and
I can hear a real
that gives us some freedom.
I can hear a real balancing here between compassion and equanimity. So on one side, you're doing your best to make the world into the best kind of place it can be, make yourself the best kind of person you can be, and all the time being buttressed with equanimity. So we get a lot of discussions today about bringing up our empathy and improving our compassion. But I think oftentimes what's missing from the conversation is that, like exactly how you started this bit of the talk, is having equanimity hold that, because you can't always improve everything. Sometimes, no matter what kind of energy you put in, it's just not yet ready
Yeah.
to give way. And that wisdom element, in some way, is what makes us. I feel like it makes us safe in a way to like engage with change and to be active in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Very much.
It's worth
It's a protection
Yeah,
to
isn't it?
have equanimity.
it's worth bringing in impermanence here. So it's something that you mentioned, and I think there's sort of two definitions of the term as far as I can tell. There's the colloquial use of the term, which means that thing isn't permanent as opposed to that thing which is. And then there's the Buddhist phrasing. Can you break down what that Buddhist phrasing actually means?
Sure. So there are, the Buddha said, three marks of existence, three qualities, three characteristics that are just define how things are. And one of those is impermanence. It's just that things are constantly changing. You know, from moment to moment, nothing is staying the same, right? Like our bodies are always changing. Our cells are being born, cells are dying. Our consciousness is always changing. We're, learning new things. We're developing new habits or ways of seeing things. Societies are always changing. Species are going extinct. New species maybe are coming into existence. New stars are being discovered. I mean, right? Like everything is always in a process of change and movement, and so, it's such an important teaching in Buddhism because our human tendency is to ignore this fact. And that's why we get stuck and we suffer a lot, is because we have an unexamined belief that things will stay the same. The things we like, especially the people that we care about, we want them to stay the same. We want them to stay around. We ourselves, we want our bodies to stay the way we like them. If we're younger, or strong in certain ways, or our minds are alert and precise. We don't want that to change, right? So there are things that we all get attached to, that we start to identify with, and we don't want that to change. But that is a recipe for suffering, because things are always changing, in small ways, in larger ways. And, the stability of whatever life we have, our society, our economy, our political, whatever it happens to manifest at the time, we may be attached to that. We may be identified with that. And when that changes, then we suffer.
I think it was Thanissaro Bhikkhu, who I read during COVID, had said, everyone's very upset that things are starting to change. And he's like, but they've always been changing. This is just revealing a fact that you were misunderstanding how long things are meant to stay. So of course we're going to come into challenging times where lots of things change. It's always changing. What a remarkably different way to see a lot of the turbulence we're going through now. So that would be really interesting to talk about now as well, because we are in what people think of as a quite turbulent time, politically turbulent, and we're facing new global challenges as a global community, maybe for the first time ever at the scale that we're encountering them. And in some ways that's very new, and in some ways it sort of seems like status quo. And so there must be something there about, I don't know, how do we confront those sort of big ripples using this wisdom of impermanence, I wonder.
Yeah. I think, so one of the practices the Buddha offered to help us really embrace impermanence is the 5 remembrances. I talk about this in my book. But he said, we should recite these every single day, because it's so easy to lull ourselves, to fall into the trance that these things aren't the case. But he said, these are the things we should remind ourselves of every day. One is, I am of the nature to grow old. I cannot escape old age. The second, I am of the nature to have ill health. I can't escape having ill health. The third, I am of the nature to die. I can't escape death. The fourth, everyone that is dear to me and all that I love are of the nature to change. I can't escape being separated from them. And the last is, my actions are my only belongings. They are the ground on which I stand. I cannot escape the consequences of my actions. So
Wow.
it's like when we die, all that we get to take with us, we don't get to take any of the things we've accumulated status-wise, material-wise. We only get to take with us the consequences of our actions, how we've lived, right? And so imagine if we would really pay attention to those 5 things every day, how that would shape our choices in a day, right? But I actually want to tell a story that Ty would often tell, and that 5 remembrances is a more personal practice, right? It's like how, but I'm thinking of the collective need to be aware of impermanence that you were speaking to, as we look at the world that we have with all these many kinds of crises that are intersecting and really challenging us at a very fundamental level as a species. And the story he tells is of a nun who was diagnosed. She lived in Vietnam. She was a senior nun in our community. She was diagnosed with terminal cancer, given 3 months to live. And she came to Plum Village. She said, well, if I have 3 months, I want to come and practice as deeply as I can and be as much in the present moment as I can. So she accepted that she was going to die. She wasn't resisting that. She said, well, let me use this time to be as fully alive as I can. And so she came to Plum Village and she practiced with all of her heart. Every day, every moment, when she would eat, she was aware of what she was eating. When she was walking, she was aware she was walking. When she looked at people, she was aware, she was really there. And so it was about time for her to go back to Vietnam. And one of the younger sisters says, well, why don't we just go to the doctor and just see how you're doing? And she's like, I don't need to do that. I know, I'm going to die. But the sister, was able to convince her. So she went, and the doctor said, your cancer is gone.
Oh.
Your cancer's gone. Couldn't find any cancer. And she ended up living another 15 years. And Ty tells that story as a collective metaphor. He says, here we are facing possible extinction as a species, right? He says, if we can accept that things are going to radically change, possibly even end, like really accept that we are on the brink of real, the end, and we put our whole hearts knowing, okay, this is it, and we live deeply, fully as a human species with other species, with the earth. Okay, we've really messed this up. Now we have just this little bit of time. How can we live deeply? He was giving it as a kind of, almost as a koan, saying, well, what could be possible for us if we really took this seriously, that we really might not have a future? And how do we want to use these last, decade, to really fully integrate this reality? And what could that make possible that hasn't been possible thus far, because we haven't integrated this reality? That huge change is about to come, or is already coming. I mean, for so many people on the planet, it's already a very terrible reality now, without enough food, without safety, without a place to live. So I find that story to be very like a North Star.
It sounds as if there's this relationship between accepting change as something that's going to happen and being able to take action, right?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that relationship?
Yeah, yeah. I guess I think about it as being in the flow of things, like aligning yourself with the way things are versus burying your head in the sand or blocking out reality. That's why the Buddha said you have to recite these 5 remembrances every single day, because the tendency, the habit, the habitual, flow of human culture is to not be aware of these things, is to try to hang on to things the way they are and to forget and to close our eyes to the fact that things are going to change. So when it happens, we're not ready, we're not prepared, we haven't been preparing the ground. But if we are ready, if we are thinking about it every day, then when change happens, we can flow with it, we can move with it, we're ready, we're packed, our bags are packed, and we can move, And, if it's something that we are reminding ourselves of on a regular basis, then we're not as shocked when it comes. And then when we are shocked, then we go into paralysis,
Yeah.
right? And we can't move, we can't respond. But if we've been, kind of removing the veils from our eyes on a regular basis, then when things fall apart, we're like, okay, yeah, this is part of the picture. Let me move in and be as helpful, as constructive in this deconstructing environment as I can, right? So there's a beautiful poem from the Hopi elders of Arizona, the Oribe mountain elder, who offers this image of, there's a stream moving very fast. Our society, right? Our reality now. If you hold on to the edge of the stream, you'll be ripped apart. You have to push off into the middle and notice who's there with you and celebrate who's there with you. And he says, know that the river has its destination. So it's like, don't fight this immense change that's coming. Push off into the middle, flow with it, be with it, notice who's there, celebrate, love each other, work together, move with this change, and let it take you where it's going to take you, adding your energy in the most beautiful, helpful, loving way you can. Don't make it worse by trying to attach to what was, by blaming each other, discriminating against each other. Well, this is your fault and this. No, okay, we're here. It's like this. Let's move with this. Let's go. And let's see how we can make the best of this situation. And loss is going to happen. Things that we wanted to preserve are going to be destroyed. But if we keep our wits about us, if we keep our head above the water, we can make something of what's coming rather than be drowned.
Wow. You could spend the rest of your life being depressed about this thing. You could resist. You could be filled with hatred. You could cause more fights. This isn't helping anything. But I hear you. If you can acceptance doesn't mean you become a couch potato or you become passive, but rather it means you keep your eyes open, head up. This is where we are. It's due to the flow of things that have come before us. And from that place of more acceptance, you open up the field of your own abilities so that you can be part of the positive change rather than just locking down and potentially being, squandering some of your potential.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so much, it's like a garden hose. When we're resisting change, we're stepping on the hose, and what we need to come through to nourish the garden can't come through. If we take our foot off of the hose, if we accept change is happening, we can get the energy we need, that the nourishment, the support, and we can do something with it. We can grow something with that.
This is leading us into a very practical part of the conversation. which is okay, so people undergo serious change in their lives all the time. This is happening in a political and economic context that's disruptive. How do we develop our abilities to get better at doing just what you did, just what you
Yeah, how do you
explained?
get the foot off the hose?
Yeah, yeah. In a time when people are really suffering,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I think we need each other. I would say the first thing is come together with other people. We can't do this alone. This is so immense what we're facing. We really need communities of sanity, islands of sanity, as Kriti Kanko talks about it. People we can um, be ourselves with, people we can grieve with, people we can dream with. You know, one of the things I also feel is so important is our imagination. We are living in a time, in a culture that has depressed our imagination. And we need to liberate it because this is what we need in this moment, each other, but also we need to be able to start envisioning how it could be different in a way that wakes up and nourishes our hearts, that inspires us. Because yes, things are going to be lost, but it doesn't mean that things, beautiful things, can't be born in their place. And we need to start getting pictures of that in our mind now. You know, I learned that, you know, all the apocalyptic films on Netflix and Amazon, it's easier for people to imagine the end of the world than it is for them to imagine the end of capitalism. Like, people are actually more attracted to these stories of mass, you know, destruction and annihilation than they are to what would it mean to very specifically in our time start to build connections in the community so that we would actually be stronger if our economy fell apart, which it's starting to do, right? What would it mean to develop, you know, community structures where we could barter, where we could, you know, offer each other, you know, exchange needed tasks and support? Those things are happening. There are communities that do their own currency all over the world. Those things are happening now. Why don't we use our imagination to start thinking about how we can build in those ways of shoring ourselves up as the structures of our society begin to break down? What kind of imagination, you know, might we put into the education that young people need right now to survive, to move through? Like, I'm talking about, we need to grow our own food. Everyone should be learning about how to grow our own food so we're less, you know, dependent on, I'm not saying everyone can grow all of their food, but like we can start having little kitchen gardens and little things you can grow inside your house, hydroponics, you know, so that you're less impacted when fossil fuel runs out and there's no transport. You know, these things are already happening. People are already thinking about this. I mean, one of the things my partner and I are thinking about and planning is to build a community, a residential community where we grow our own food, where we use renewable energy, where we have training set up. It's a spiritual community where we practice together, but where we have a refuge, a place for people to land where we get to be cared for, where everyone gets to be cared for, where as structures become less reliable, there is something that we can, you know, move forward with in our lives because we have each other, because we have, you know, the earth and land and water and, you know, things we can make with our hands and food we can eat and joy we can bring to each other with, you know, all the things people can do when they get together, sing and dance and create and imagine and envision new realities.
It's difficult to know what to add. Um,
No, it's perfect. I mean, it's a
how,
great answer. You know, what do we do next? We get together and we dream. And then some things that are very challenging might turn out to be the beginnings of something very beautiful because some systems aren't persistent, they're not sustainable. And so they end. And that creates space for new kinds of systems to grow. I love this vision.
And how do we start to see the positive side of that? Because right now we're caught only in the negative, you know, the loss, the ending, the uncertainty. But I think we do need to also see the opening that's happening with the breaking down of our culture and societies. There is an opening, and that's where we need the imagination, and where we need also the spiritual practice that can help us to see, you know, this is the way of the world, that things break down and new things emerge, but we do need to seize this time to be able to make the most of it so that things don't just take us over.
What particular spiritual practices do you have in mind that people can start today?
You know, paying attention to beauty. I was listening to a really nice interview on a podcast. Someone named Nick from the UK, but leadership person who works with Jim Bendel and deep adaptation work. But he was talking about seeing the extraordinary in the ordinary as just a basic fundamental practice. And that is what mindfulness helps us to do, right? Is really like, if we are able to take in the beauty that's around us, to slow our minds down enough to like get out of our discursive thinking enough to appreciate that we're breathing in and we're breathing out, to appreciate the miracle of our heart beating, the fact that the sun is rising and setting on time every single day so reliably. You know, I was listening to the sound of the birds yesterday. We took a walk in this wonderful park. I never fail to feel inspired when I hear the sound of the birds. And I told my husband, I was like, can you imagine what the world would be like without bird song? We wouldn't be able to be fully human if we didn't have bird song. Like, we need other creatures to help us be fully human. And I think like taking the time to appreciate, I mean, the smells of all the flowers and all the blossoms that are out this time of year, that brings me so much joy and so much relief, honestly, to just take in the scent of the honeysuckle or the linden blossoms. And, you know, that's the world offering itself to us every single day, every single moment. And if we can really be with the world, you know, when things start to really crumble, we can draw on those sources of inspiration, bring up those memories, bring up those, you know, experiences to help stay nourished and grounded, to be able to respond, to be able to act, to be able to bring something to a situation of grief, of loss, of terror. So we actually need to shore up all of these things of beauty in our life. Well, we need to do that in any case, but you know, with all that's happening, all the breakdown, these things keep our mind balanced. They keep us sane. One other piece I'll add is, you know, this whole thing about using the imagination. One practice is just to not assume that we know what it's going to be like. I mean, I've already said things that are projecting a certain, you know, framing of how this,
Directionality.
you know, which is more on the darker side, more on the, you know, but I think it's important to keep an open heart and mind that we just don't know. We know things are going to, you know, change, but how we approach that change is up to us. So to stay like as neutral as we can, like we just don't know how it's going to be. You know how sometimes you catastrophize about the future and you think, oh, if this happens, this will be so terrible and this is how I'll be. And sometimes it actually works out that you are in this really difficult situation, but you're not the way you imagined yourself to be. You're actually quite strong, quite steady, quite, you know, even happy. What would it be like to think of humans being able to be happily and peacefully encountering, you know, total systems change? It's possible.
Kaira, where can everybody find you online?
So I have a website, kairajewel.com, and I have, you know, weekly groups that I lead, and yeah, online courses and on apps, meditations on Insight Timer and Calm and Breathe and Plum Village app.
Brilliant. Wilson, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast.
Thank you both so much for having me.
That was the Contemplative Science Podcast. That was Kaira Jewel Lingo. And thanks for listening. And as always, we will see you next week.